Zabriskie Point. When MGM handed Italian auteur Michelangelo Antonioni a budget and creative control to capture the American counterculture, they expected magic. What they got was Zabriskie Point, a slow, philosophical, and visually mesmerizing film that baffled just about everyone. Following two disillusioned youths through the California desert, the movie had barely any plot, but plenty of existential stares and psychedelic imagery. Audiences walked out. Critics scratched their heads. The box office returns were abysmal. It was one of MGM's most expensive experiments and quickly became one of its most notorious bombs. Antonioni's European sensibility didn't translate for American audiences, expecting a rebel anthem or something as kinetic as Easy Rider. Instead, they got a meditative art piece that moved like molasses under the desert sun. But here's the kicker. Decades later, Zabriskie Point was reevaluated as a misunderstood visual poem. Its explosive finale, quite literally a slow-motion orgy of consumerist destruction, is now hailed as a masterpiece of avant-garde cinema. Pink Floyd's haunting score didn't hurt either. It flopped hard, yes. But buried beneath the sand of 70s film history lies a hypnotic, daring work far ahead of its time. Antonioni dared to hold a mirror to America's spiritual emptiness. And America promptly smashed it. Bobby Deerfield. Al Pacino was riding high. After The Godfather, Serpico, and Dog Day Afternoon, he was Hollywood's golden boy. So when Bobby Deerfield came along, a romantic drama set against the backdrop of Formula One racing, expectations were sky high. Instead, audiences got a slow-burning meditation on mortality, identity, and love that no one quite knew what to do with. Directed by Sidney Pollack and based on Eric Maria Remarque's novel, Bobby Deerfield follows a brooding race car driver who falls in love with a terminally ill woman. The pacing was glacial, the mood melancholic, the tone decidedly European, and that's what threw off most American viewers. They expected Days of Thunder. What they got was a moody art house romance wrapped in silence and sorrow. The reviews were brutal. Critics called it self-indulgent and overly dramatic. Audiences simply didn't show up. The film made a fraction of its budget back and was quietly buried by the studio. But, for all its flaws, Bobby Deerfield remains a haunting time capsule of 70s cinema, trying to grow up emotionally. Pacino's subdued performance has aged surprisingly well, and its lingering sense of melancholy resonates more today than it did in its own time. Sometimes, a flop isn't a failure, just a film waiting for the right eyes. 1776. You'd think a Broadway hit about the American Revolution would be a slam dunk as a movie. But when 1776 hit theaters in 1972, audiences responded with a collective shrug. This musical dramatization of the Declaration of Independence was packed with catchy songs, bold performances, and even historical flair. But moviegoers were in no mood for Founding Father sing-alongs, especially not in the middle of the Vietnam War and Watergate disillusionment. Directed by Peter H. Hunt and starring William Daniels as a singing John Adams, 1776 tried to walk the line between patriotic grandeur and playful irreverence. But critics found the tone confusing, too stiff to be fun, too corny to be serious. Some schools and organizations embraced it, but general audiences didn't bite. Columbia Pictures trimmed over 20 minutes from the theatrical release, fearing it was too long and too dry. Ironically, many of the cuts hurt its narrative clarity and musical flow, and by the time the full version resurfaced decades later, it was too late. Today, 1776 is appreciated by historians and musical lovers for what it was, an earnest, if awkward attempt to teach history through harmony. A flop, yes, but one that dared to be smarter and more sincere than it needed to be. The Missouri Breaks, it should have been a triumph. Marlon Brando, Jack Nicholson. A revisionist Western helmed by One-Eyed Jack's screenwriter, Thomas McGuane, and directed by Arthur Penn, fresh off Bonnie and Clyde. But The Missouri Breaks was anything but triumphant. It was strange, it was uneven, and it absolutely bombed. Set in late 19th century Montana, the film follows a rustler and a hired regulator locked in a deadly game of cat and mouse. The script was moody and modernist, but Brando took it into another dimension. He refused to play it straight, appearing in bizarre costumes and improvising lines in Irish and Scottish accents. One moment, he's terrifying. The next, he's parodying himself. Audiences didn't know what to make of it. Critics were divided. Some praised its ambition, most called it a mess. It failed to make back its bloated $6 million budget and quickly faded into obscurity. And yet, it remains fascinating. A gonzo experiment in genre deconstruction. Brando's performance, while derided at the time, has since been reevaluated as brilliantly bizarre. The Missouri Breaks didn't just break expectations, it blew them apart. The Last Tycoon, adapted from F. Scott Fitzgerald's unfinished novel and directed by Elia Kazan, his final film, The Last Tycoon had every reason to succeed. It starred Robert De Niro as Monroe's star, a thinly veiled stand-in for MGM producer Irving Thalberg, and boasted a cast of Hollywood heavyweights like Jack Nicholson, Tony Curtis, and Robert Mitchum. But the film was a ghost of its potential. Slow, moody, and introspective, it delved into the melancholy of a man losing control in a crumbling studio system. Audiences wanted glamour and nostalgia. Instead, they got a quiet dirge about artistic decay. Critics admired its ambition, but felt emotionally distanced. The film flopped hard at the box office. Over time, though, The Last Tycoon has found a place in the hearts of cinephiles who appreciate its sadness and subtlety. De Niro's performance, reserved and internal, mirrors the fading dream factory it portrays. It wasn't the grand swan song Kazan may have envisioned, but it remains a haunting farewell to Hollywood's golden age, one that's tragically underappreciated. The Hindenburg disaster films ruled the 70s, and Universal wanted a historical hit to ride the wave. Enter the Hindenburg, a dramatization of the infamous German airship explosion, directed by Robert Wise and starring George C. Scott. They poured money into realistic sets, period costumes, and even built a full-scale model of the doomed blimp. But instead of a gripping thriller, audiences got a sluggish hybrid of espionage mystery and historical melodrama. The special effects were dazzling, but the rest of the film couldn't keep up. The build-up felt endless, the characters thin, and the tension muted, despite knowing the inevitable fiery climax. Critics deflated the hype. While it received Oscar nods for technical work, the film flopped financially and critically, barely recouping its massive costs. Still, it has its defenders. The final explosion remains a practical effects triumph, and the film's meticulous production design has aged well. The Hindenburg wasn't the disaster film audiences expected, but it's far from a disaster itself. The Island of Dr. Maro, based on H.G. Wells's unsettling novel, this adaptation of The Island of Dr. Maro promised a chilling story of science run amok. With Burt Lancaster as the titular mad doctor, expectations were high. Audiences anticipated horror. What they got was a murky blend of science fiction, moral philosophy, and lukewarm suspense. The story, about a remote island where animals are transformed into humanoid abominations, is rich in dread and ethical unease. But the execution stumbled, the pacing dragged, the makeup effects, rather than horrifying, bordered on campy. And despite Lancaster's gravitas, the film never committed to its darkest potential. Released amidst a golden age of sharp science fiction like Star Wars and Close Encounters, Moreau looked outdated and tame by comparison. It faded into obscurity, a failed curiosity in an era bursting with genre innovation. But for some, that failure is part of the charm. Its atmosphere is undeniably eerie, and its themes of hubris and evolution still spark debate. Later adaptations fared even worse, making this 1977 version look downright dignified. A flop, absolutely, but one with enduring creepiness and haunting potential. Lucky Lady, with Gene Hackman, Burt Reynolds, and Liza Minnelli headlining, Lucky Lady was tailor-made for success. Set during Prohibition, the film follows three bootleggers navigating danger and romance on the high seas. On paper, it had blockbuster written all over it. Behind the scenes, however, chaos reigned. Studio meddling, rewrites, and clashing visions between director Stanley Donen and the screenwriters of The Sting led to a muddled final cut. The film couldn't decide if it was a romantic comedy, action caper, or satire. It tried to be all three, and became none. Audiences were confused, critics were harsher. Despite its glossy veneer and star power, Lucky Lady sank at the box office, taking with it a then huge $13 million investment. But over time, the film's eccentric charm has earned a small fan base. It's a beautiful wreck, full of vintage style, odd chemistry, and moments that almost work. Not a hidden masterpiece, but a glittery misstep with enough curiosity value to deserve a second glance. At Long Last Love, Peter Bogdanovich was Hollywood royalty in the early 70s. With hits like The Last Picture Show and Paper Moon, studios trusted his instincts blindly. So, when he proposed a tribute to 1930s musicals, complete with Cole Porter songs and live-on-set performances, Fox said yes without blinking. What they got was At Long Last Love, starring Burt Reynolds and Sybil Shepherd in roles that required more vocal skill than either possessed. Bogdanovich refused to overdub. He wanted spontaneity. What he got was chaos. The musical numbers were off-key, the pacing erratic, and the charm painfully forced. Critics tore it apart. Audiences laughed, not with it, but at it. It didn't just flop, it cratered, embarrassing everyone involved and ending Bogdanovich's winning streak. Fox had bet big and lost even bigger. But years later, a re-edited version began to win defenders. The sincerity, the throwback aesthetic, even the amateurish musical charm. Suddenly, it all seemed endearing. Today, At Long Last Love is still a flawed film, but one that dared to try something whimsical and old-fashioned in a gritty, cynical decade. A flop, yes, but a fascinating one. Darling Lily. Julie Andrews and director Blake Edwards were Hollywood's golden couple. Darling Lily was meant to be their glamorous, high-budget masterpiece, a musical espionage romance set during World War I. It had everything: lavish costumes, soaring ballads, and Andrews in full star mode. But it also had one major problem. Nobody knew what kind of movie it was. Paramount poured over $25 million into the film, a staggering sum in 1970. But endless rewrites, production delays, and an uncertain tone derailed everything. Was it a light-hearted musical? A war thriller? A romantic spy story? In trying to be all of them, it succeeded at none. The film was butchered in post-production, with whole scenes hacked away. What premiered was a confusing, uneven mess. Audiences were baffled, critics were merciless, and Paramount took a huge financial hit. Yet buried under all that wreckage was a strange beauty. In recent years, director's cuts and reappraisals have revealed Darling Lily as a bold, misunderstood swing at something grand. Not a success, but certainly not forgettable. New York, New York. Coming off Taxi Driver, Martin Scorsese was a critical darling. So when he aimed to blend the razzle-dazzle of classic MGM musicals with gritty improvisational realism, expectations were high. New York, New York, starring Liza Minnelli and Robert De Niro, looked like Oscar bait on paper. But what landed on screen was a jarring tonal experiment. Minnelli brought old-school Broadway sparkle. De Niro brought dark, brooding method acting. Their worlds collided in a film that felt emotionally chaotic and structurally disjointed. The runtime ballooned, the narrative meandered, and audiences didn't know what to make of it. It flopped, hard. Scorsese was devastated, spiraling into addiction and nearly destroying his career. Ironically, the movie's theme song, New York, New York, became a timeless anthem, outliving the film that introduced it. Today, cinephiles see New York as a daring misfire, ambitious, flawed, but unforgettable. A film that tried to marry two eras of Hollywood and ended up lost in translation. Lost Horizon. Imagine a utopian paradise set to music. That was the dream behind Lost Horizon, a remake of the 1937 classic, this time stuffed with Broadway numbers, big stars, and a glossy vision of Shangri-La. Columbia Pictures spent a fortune on it. With Ross Hunter producing and Charles Jarrett directing, they aimed for a big-hearted, inspirational hit. Instead, they got one of the most ridiculed musicals of the decade. The songs were forgettable at best, cringeworthy at worst. The choreography felt outdated, and the casting of Peter Finch and Liv Ullmann, neither known for musical talent, only added to the tonal whiplash. Audiences were confused, critics were brutal. Columbia took a massive loss. The film quickly became a Hollywood punchline, but decades later, it's being re-examined not as a success, but as a curious relic of a studio system out of step with its time. Lost Horizon is like a beautifully wrapped gift box with nothing inside, but oh, what a fascinating box it is. The Wrath of God. You've probably never heard of The Wrath of God, and that's the tragedy. Starring Robert Mitchum as a mysterious gun-toting priest in 1920s Central America, the film was a bold fusion of spaghetti western, political drama, and spiritual odyssey. It had assassins posing as holy men, revolutionaries, redemption, betrayal, all the makings of something epic. But the tone? Hollywood couldn't figure it out. The marketing didn't help. Was it a gritty action flick? A religious parable? A Latin American adventure? Nobody knew, least of all the studio. When it hit theaters, audiences stayed away, and critics didn't know what to make of its unusual blend of grit and grace. Behind the scenes, the production had its struggles, but the final product was more coherent than it was ever given credit for. Mitchum's performance was soulful and steely. The atmosphere was rich with tension and meaning. Over time, The Wrath of God has quietly developed a cult following. It's now seen as a gutsy experiment that was simply too strange, too bold, and too morally complex for the time. It didn't get the love it deserved, but it still stands tall as one of the 1970s most intriguing forgotten flops. Sextet, the flop that destroyed the studio. Sextet wasn't just a failure. It was the final nail in the coffin for an entire studio division. United Artists' once bold experiment with risque, lowbrow comedy crumbled under this one film. At 84, Mae West insisted on playing her iconic persona, the sassy, seductive bombshell. The problem? Time had marched on, and West refused to admit it. Sextet was a chaotic mess, full of cringy double entendres, bizarre musical numbers, and baffling cameos. Ringo Starr, Timothy Dalton, Alice Cooper, and Dom DeLuise all circled around a paper-thin plot involving spies, sex, and a honeymoon in chaos. West couldn't remember her lines. She relied on cue cards and voice dubbing. Scenes were reshot constantly, and tensions on set grew unbearable. But United Artists kept pouring money in, hoping to spark a cult hit. Instead, they got one of the most embarrassing flops in cinema history. Sextet was annihilated by critics, ignored by audiences, and became a cautionary tale overnight. The financial loss, combined with the reputational damage, triggered internal collapse. UA's comedy division, already struggling, was shut down. Executives were fired. The studio would never again take such a gamble on a star clinging to a bygone era. Today, Sextet is a tragicomic relic, both fascinating and painful to watch. It didn't just flop, it detonated. A Winter Kills, a paranoid political thriller loosely inspired by JFK conspiracy theories. Winter Kills had everything going for it. A razor-sharp script, an incredible cast, and a chilling premise about power, lies, and American history. But behind the camera, chaos. Financing came from dubious sources, including actual organized crime. The production was shut down multiple times, crew members weren't paid, and producers were later arrested for drug trafficking. That's not a joke. Winter Kills was partially bankrolled by criminal enterprises. The film finally limped into theaters in 1979 for about 5 minutes. It was pulled almost immediately, with no real marketing, no support, and no chance to build an audience. Despite glowing early reviews, the movie vanished, its potential buried under lawsuits and scandal. But for those who've seen it, Winter Kills is a razor-edged masterpiece. Brilliantly edited, wickedly dark, and way ahead of its time, it's now hailed as one of the most daring political thrillers of the decade. A flop at release, yes. But, in truth, one of the sharpest knives the 70s ever threw at the American dream. These 15 films flopped when it mattered most, at the box office. But time has a funny way of rewriting history. Misunderstood, mistimed, or just too bold for their era, these underrated 1970s flops prove that failure can be fascinating, and sometimes even legendary. Don't forget to subscribe for more.